Greetings, friends. Russia's going to win the war in Ukraine. They're going to win because it's a war of attrition. They can produce more shells than the Ukrainians can get from the United States and other Western partners. They can produce more soldiers than the Ukrainians can produce. Most of the Ukrainian fighting men have been severely dented in that category of the population distribution, men between the ages of 20 to 40. Many of them have already been killed or injured. Some of them escaped the country, and now the military is relying on older men, and apart from foreign volunteers, which are less likely to volunteer now that they know that the war is not going as well for the West. The United States isn't going to escalate to an all-out situation where they put American soldiers onto the ground. They have been escalating, it's true. There are crazy neocons. Well, all neocons are crazy and neoliberals. They want war, and they want to just defeat the Russian Empire and break it up. So whatever you feel about Russia, whether you support it or not, the fact is that Russia is fighting in its own backyard, and they have the industrial capacity and the planning to produce way more shells. So for that metric, they're going to win because it's a war of artillery. That's what the attrition does, World War I style. You just lob a bunch of shells at the area. You have to keep producing shells. You have to produce more shells than the enemy. Ukraine ran out of shells. They were using cluster munitions. Now, cluster munitions are a sign that they ran out of the normal shell that they needed. Even though cluster munitions are very terrible, they're just using it because the standard shell cannot be produced to what they need at the time. Russia started the war with a gamble which was well calculated to force Ukraine into a political settlement, not to be in NATO, not to allow NATO missiles, and to stop the war in the Donbass. Let the Donbass alone, or sovereign, or perhaps part of Russia, but either way, stop all that nonsense in the eastern regions. And they did this gamble by moving a bunch of the military into the country suddenly, and it overtook Ukraine, and they couldn't really withstand it, and they were threatening the capital. They occupied a huge amount of territory, or at least covered a huge amount of Ukrainian territory right in the beginning of the war back in 2022 in February, late February, when this all began. Then they forced Ukraine into the negotiating table because the Russian army was literally outside Kiev on multiple sides and looked like they could close in. And reasonably, the regime in Kiev, the Zelensky regime, was willing to negotiate, but the Western backers, who really put Zelensky in there in the first place, decided at the last minute to prevent this. This would have been the United States, and particularly Great Britain. It was Boris Johnson who is said to have flown to meet with Zelensky on the eve of this agreement with the Russians to stop this agreement, to say, no, we will support you at all costs, we'll give you anything you need, all the money you need, all the weapons you need, we will be in it for the long haul. NATO has your back, even though you're not part of NATO, but we in Great Britain and the United States, we've got your back. This was Boris Johnson, and Zelensky changed his tune and backed out of the deal. Now, this greatly angered Putin, as we understand, because he felt stabbed in the back. One of the acts of good faith was to withdraw Russians from around the capital and from these great regions, which, to admit, they were overextended anyways. This was part of the gamble. They were overextended, the Russians, to do this, but it worked diplomatically until it didn't. But it was made as a token to say, okay, let's have peace, honor your end of the agreement. But Zelensky didn't. Once the Russians had withdrawn from around Kiev and around from much of that territory in the north that they had occupied, they hardened their stance again and decided to resist the Russians. So it's been very difficult to convince the Russians that the West and Ukraine is interested in a serious negotiation, a serious end to the conflict. It's been very difficult to convince them of this because they've been screwed over here, and they've been screwed over before, played for fools in the negotiations. It's happened several times over the years. So it's very difficult to negotiate with the Zelensky regime. It's possible that there will be no negotiations with that regime as long as that man is still leader of that country and his guys are still controlling the country. So it's a war of attrition. Russia's not an invincible power. I don't think they're going to conquer the world or anything. They have plenty of weaknesses. They're weak in Crimea. They're not the Soviet Union. They're not as big as they used to be. But they were severely underestimated. They were underestimated economically in how they would respond to the sanctions. They managed to weather that storm, and they were underestimated militarily. They are fighting in their own backyard. Ukraine is geographically of huge importance to Russia based on where it is and the historical importance of that region. So I can't go into all the reasons for the war here. I've talked about that before. But this is why they are investing in a long war, because they have to fight at some point, so this is the place to fight. And if it's going to be an attrition war, then the United States is not interested in that. They've already said that they're not going to do that. They're interested in fighting China in an economic war or otherwise some kind of war. They've said that as much. So we're going to hear more in the narrative now. We're going to hear the mainstream media saying, oh, stalemate in Ukraine, or a truce, or a temporary peace, or negotiations. Well, as far as we can see, there aren't going to be any serious negotiations. And you could say it's a kind of a stalemate if Russia doesn't advance any further, but there's kind of like fighting on the sides. But the thing is, those territories that Russia has taken from Ukraine remain part of Russia to this day, and they have not been recaptured. And how can you have a stalemate if Russia advances in the future, which they may do? How are we to say now that Putin will not advance further and occupy more of Ukraine? The Ukrainian offensive has failed. The Ukrainians had their big shot. They wasted their third army. They've already lost several armies. Because as I mentioned, I should have backed up. The first phase of the war failed. The Russians backed up. They were overextended. They backed up again in Kharkiv region, which didn't involve losing in any real battles, but they backed up then. That was about a year ago, last fall. And then they backed out of Kherson because they were overextended there. And then they solidified their lines. That was it. So they did surrender some territory strategically, and then they solidified their lines. They built 3 lines of defense, inspired, you might say, by the French Maginot Line, I believe of the First World War period. The same idea, multiple lines of defense, bunkers, minefields, extremely dense minefields. They've all been planned out. The Ukrainians in their offensive, which was launched on June 4th, 2023, failed to reach the first line of defense except in a few exceptions. They have reached the first line of defense finally after weeks of fighting in some places. But generally, no, in most places they have not even reached the first line of Russian defenses. So their whole offensive has failed. So if things remain as they are, you could say, oh, stalemate, because there's no more advancing, even though Russians occupy more territory. The question is, what happens now? What happens now that the Ukrainian offensive is finally spent? The weather's changing, getting muddier, getting colder. Are the Russians going to wait? Are they going to wait longer? Are they going to wait for the following spring? Everyone's been over-predicting. On the side which recognizes that Russia is probably going to win, that's the side like the Duran, people like that who I followed, people like Douglas MacGregor, they all thought that Russia was going to launch an offensive last winter, and that never ended up happening. So we can get predictions wrong too. But at some point, it's reasonable to assume the Russians will advance further. Why would they not? They have to stop this threat from developing again in the future. And the way things are right now, you cannot leave Avdiivka as it is. You cannot leave Kupiansk as it is. You may have to go all the way up to the Dnieper River. You may have to go and occupy Kiev. It's reasonable to expect they want to occupy Odessa as well, because it's the most important port leading into the country, and you would want to starve the enemy of that port. And it is historically Russian as well, Odessa. So there's good reason to assume the Russians are not going to stop until they occupy more of Ukraine. But they're not going to take Western Ukraine because it's right next to Poland, and the Western Ukrainians really don't like the Russians, and they have said as much. The Russians have said, no, we're not going to take Western Ukraine. And Poland, whatever you want to do, they even warned Poland, like, don't get involved, don't fight us in the rest of the country, but if you want to go into Western Ukraine, we're not going to stop you, Poland. They said this. So that's what the fate of Ukraine is looking at right now. It's looking at some option of either being a rump state, or certainly smaller than what it is currently now, or in a best case scenario, which I find hard to imagine, just keeping things as they are right now, just surrendering the territory. They're going to keep shooting missiles at Crimea. They're going to keep harassing the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, because Russia is exposed there. So Russia's not invincible. Russia's going to have some problems continuing, but in a meaningful sense, they're not going to take back those territories. They're not going to take back Crimea. They may continue to harass it though. But in a meaningful sense, Ukraine is not going to take any of that territory back. So absolute best case scenario, that's what happens. They just manage to hold on to the territory they still have. But I don't even see how that can happen, because the Ukrainian military has been decimated even before the current or now concluded offensive. They already wasted 2 armies. This is the 3rd army they've destroyed, and this was like the biggest one, at least biggest in terms of Western armor, Western equipment, heavy vehicles and tanks. The latest versions of these tanks, many of them destroyed on the battlefield, captured, destroyed en masse, destroyed often in minefields, destroyed by poor training. NATO training was not enough to bring these soldiers and these tank crews up to speed on the battlefield. And it's not necessarily even the right tactics for the circumstances. So for various reasons, the Ukrainian military is spent. Where are they going to get the manpower? Where are they going to get the vehicles? They can get money because the West can keep giving them money forever. But how are they going to win a war of attrition? It's an old-style war of attrition that Russia has committed to fighting. You can beat Russia if you are willing to go all out, but look at the West. They don't really want to do that. They want to focus on the next thing and get people distracted. So I could be wrong, and we'll see what happens, but that's what it looks like to me. Hasta luego, amigos.